Hello and welcome to Threads of Fate. I am your host, Kira Ryberg, and this is a podcast all about astrology, divination, and the threads of fate that weave throughout all of our lives. Today, we are back with another forecast, and we are going to be looking at the astrology of December 2025. This is an interesting month. We've got a lot of planets coming into contact with Saturn in particular, doing a lot of Saturn squares. There is a bit of a heaviness that is going to take us through the end of the year, along with a bit of sluggishness. But we are going to get into all of the details, all of the drama, all of the tea. So stay tuned. And if you're excited to hear about the astrology, then make sure to leave a review wherever you listen to your podcast, like this if you are listening on YouTube, and don't forget to subscribe. All right, let's dive right in. So the month really begins in earnest on December 4th when we have a full moon at 13 degrees of Gemini. Now, the day before this full moon happens, we actually have the moon conjoining Uranus for the first time since Uranus re-entered Taurus. So what is really interesting about this dynamic, I think, is that it's almost like the moon tends to usher things into being, and she brings them into a greater awareness of our kind of immediate sphere. So when she conjoins Uranus, we're going to get a little bit of a taster of what that transit is really all about for us, what we still need to unearth, unpack, change, and shift in the Taurus part of our chart right before the moon enters into Gemini and starts going closer and closer to the opposition with the sun, which is what brings us into that full moon. And for me, when I see a moon Uranus conjunction, we get one every month, it tends to bring about shifts in awareness, especially bodily awareness or kind of our immediate circumstances. So it feels like there is a change that kind of happens, and then it gets highlighted and brought to a climax when we have the full moon. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the chart of the moment for that full moon so we can talk about it a little more. Now, it happens at 13 degrees of Gemini, like I was saying before. And that means anyone who has placements around 10 to 16 degrees of mutable signs, which are Gemini, Sagittarius, Virgo, and Pisces, is going to be the most impacted by this full moon. All full moons are going to bring things to a little bit of a climax in that area of your life. It doesn't mean that it's going to be fireworks and major changes and a whole new lease on life, but it does tend to mean that whatever has been kind of bubbling in that part of your life for the last 6 months to a year, we start to really understand and gain a greater awareness of what's been going on, because things are quite literally being illuminated by the light of the moon. When you look outside on the night of a full moon, it's really bright, right? That is literally the symbolic context of a full moon. We are bringing something to light in the Gemini part of your chart. And that should help you gain a greater awareness around what's going on there, what needs to shift there, what feels good there, and what stories have been kind of rumbling in the background that maybe haven't been occupying as much of your attention up until this point. Now, this lunation is going to occur in the middle decan of Gemini, which is a Venus-Mars decan. If you haven't been following along on the decan series that Chloe Margarita and I have been doing on this channel and on this podcast, and I would highly recommend that you go listen to the Gemini 2 episode, because that is going to be an hour's worth of information all about the story that we are going to be engaging with during this time. But the TLDR of it all is that this is a decan of contradiction. It is a decan of creation and applying the heat of Mars to the beauty of Venus in order to bring something into being in a way that is often requiring a lot of toil and labor, because that is the martial component of this, but it is also in order to do something creative, connective, relational, which is the Venus component of this decan. It also is one that does not like to be put into a box, and where we see a desire to be more than one thing or to do more than one thing. And so as we reach this climax in Gemini 2, think about what house this occupies for yourself, because you might start to feel like you want to break free of any restrictions that have been placed on you, any ideas that have been told to you that you cannot do or cannot express this part of your life in more than one way, because this is kind of like the both and decan, as Austin Coppock calls it. It's like, I want to be both this and that. And that is really what we see coming to a head in this part of the chart. Now, what's interesting is that when we contrast that with the second decan of Sagittarius, where the sun is moving through, this is a moon Mars decan. So we have Mars showing up quite a bit actually in this lunation. One, by virtue of the fact that Mars is also going to be in Sagittarius with the sun. So the moon is going to be opposing Mars at the time of this full moon, and also through the decans that both the moon and the sun are placed in. Mars is always going to bring up this question around what is worth fighting for, what is worth taking action around, what do you want to pour your energy into? And in particular, what obstacles do you feel compelled to overcome even when it's difficult? Because Mars is also going to be approaching a very tight square with Saturn, which we're going to get into a little bit more in a moment here. But that is kind of bringing up this tension point between having a lot of this martial impulse present to toil away at something, to pour a lot of time and energy into something, only to be met with some form of resistance. And I think a big part of the question that we're getting to the heart of with this full moon is, what do you really want to pour that energy into? What's worth it, really? And that is also a big theme that we see show up with the Mars-Saturn square that we're going to talk about. Now, in this decan of Gemini, we often find people who are occupying the margins. And in this decan of Sagittarius, people who are kind of engaging with underworld themes. So I wouldn't be surprised if we also see some things being unearthed about people who have maybe been oppressed, put on the margins, who are foreigners in some context, or who are not necessarily granted the virtue of being on the inside of the societal kind of structure that we see. That's more of like a global signification rather than a personal one. But I would not be surprised if we see things coming to light around people who have been exiled, who we tend to deem as foreigners, because the deity that's associated with this is Kailele, and she is a foreigner deity. And so there's a lot of things that come up with this part of the zodiac that relate to being on the outside, on the fringes, even if you are being granted kind of a special spot as a deity, but it's still kind of like being on the outside a little bit. And this one is Core, the deity that's associated with Sagittarius too, where the sun is going to be during this full moon on December 4th. And so that one is a little bit more associated with the underworld. So bringing things to light that we don't always look at, things that are buried, things that have a lot to do with different power structures in the world, right? And as this relates to your own life, it might be showing you where you feel a little bit like you're on the outside in the Gemini part of your chart, and what you need to unearth and unpack in that kind of underworldy context where you need to dig deep and go within in the Sagittarius part of your chart to hopefully bring these things into greater alignment and greater harmony. Now, what's interesting about this full moon, on top of all of that, is that it's also exactly square the nodal axis. So the south node and the north node are currently occupying 13 degrees of Virgo and Pisces at this time. So this really connects this full moon back into the story that is unfolding in that part of your chart that's aligning with the eclipses. And so think about the major changes, the beginnings, the endings, the fate patterns, all of the different chaos and confusion that the nodes have been stirring up in Virgo and Pisces, because this full moon, this illumination is deeply connected with that. And when we think about that, it can sound a little confusing because now we're bringing in all of these different parts of the chart, but they're all intimately connected, right? Gemini and Virgo are both ruled by Mercury. Jupiter rules Sagittarius and Pisces. So whatever axis this occupies for you is actually all interconnected anyway. And right now with this full moon, we're seeing a little bit of a tug and pull. So for example, if you're a Virgo rising, like we see in this chart here, if you're watching the video version, right, then this would be activating your 10th and 4th house by virtue of the full moon, but also your 1st and 7th house, because you are having the nodes move through that part of your chart. The 1st house, 7th house axis has a lot to do with self and other, with your personal journey and your relationships or the journey that your partner is on. And the 4th and 10th house axis has a lot to do with your home, your living situation, your family, and your career, the things you do in the public visible eye. So when we think about the ways all of those different things could come together, there could be an illumination of things that is progressing in your professional world that is also causing you to dig deep into the concept of home, foundations, and family, and the ways that those two things are also impacting both your personal journey and the journey of your relationship that you're currently on. right? So it's like maybe you get an opportunity in your career that is going to shift and change the foundations or where you're living. And that's going to have an impact on both you and your partner that ties back into that greater first house, seventh house story that's happening with the nodes. That's just like a little bit of an example. But there's some fated circumstances that are arising that require some balancing from the Gemini Sagittarius part of your chart. And we kind of have to think about how these two axes talk to one another in order to fully get the story that is unraveling here, because they are a lot more intertwined than you might anticipate. Now, both the moon and the sun are going to be in the bounds of Venus at this time, which I really like because there is kind of a more intense martial component to this. But the bounds tell us what tools a planet has to work with, what their immediate environment is allowing them to express as. And the bounds of Venus are ones that are very focused on using the tools of creativity and connection to bring things together and to generate more harmony in the world. So I think that's a really beautiful kind of softening to some of the other martial components that we see with this, right? It's like it gives it a affectionate kind of quality and an ability to compromise when we come up against any type of conflict or opposition that Mars might be bringing to the table. So think about the ways that you're going to want to be expressing yourself in a multitude of ways, right? With that moon in Gemini too, embracing contradiction, fighting for what you truly believe in, fighting for your ability to occupy the fringes and to be on the inside of something, doing that deep inner work with the sun in Sagittarius too, in order to protect something that feels really sacred for you. And the ways that that is also playing into the greater kind of nodal story that we see playing out in Virgo and Pisces. And that's going to be kind of that full moon for us. It's a big one, right? And it occurs in some tense aspects to Mars and Saturn. So it's a little rough around the edges. And I think we have to lean on those tools of Venus to be able to navigate it in a way that feels generative and supportive for us. But it can also be a time where there is greater relational discomfort, where we are running up against some opposition in some sense, whether it's internal or external, mostly going to be showing up dependent on where this falls in your chart, right? So really want to think about what houses this occupies for you. So that's that full moon. A couple days later, we are going to have the Mars-Saturn square. Now, there's no kind of nice way to say that the Mars-Saturn harsh aspects, whether it's a square, a conjunction, an opposition, they just suck. They're not fun. They're not the happy-go-lucky, easygoing transit. And I'm never going to be the astrologer that lies to you. This one just doesn't look like a whole lot of fun, you know? And in particular, this is going to be more intense for people who are in Sagittarius or Pisces perfections, because Mars is moving through Sagittarius. Saturn is currently moving through Pisces and is still at the same degree that they stationed direct at in November. So really, this is going to be a little bit more intense for anybody who has Sagittarius, Pisces, Aries, Scorpio, Cap, Aqua perfection years right now, which think about that. That's a lot of us. That's a lot of people, right? That's like half the zodiac. And so we're all going to be feeling this in some way. And I say that not to, make it sound like it's going to be all bad for everyone, but also to walk with a little bit more empathy and compassion at this time, both for yourself and others, because we're all going to be running up against some form of difficulty, right? And that's not to say that squares are always bad, because squares actually can be really supportive. They can be a catalyst for action. But Mars and Saturn are the two malefic planets. When you look up what malefic means, it literally translates to evil doer, right? We need planets in astrology that are going to talk about the difficulties and the challenges that life brings. And Mars and Saturn do that. So when they start squaring one another, you can think of this as them literally both putting their dukes up and they're about to square off. They're going to fight. They're going to come into a conflict. Squares are of the nature of Mars, right? So Mars inflames things, Mars activates things, and that can cause us to take action and get moving, but it can also cause us to come into conflict with something. So it's not really going to feel super fun. And I would anticipate there's going to be some tension between the Sagittarius part of your chart, part of your life, and the Pisces part of your chart and the Pisces part of your life, right? So we kind of have the two planets that are most capable of bringing challenges to the table, getting activated in a challenging way that is not going to feel so nice. Now, Mars and Saturn both agree on difficulty and hardship, right? So when they come into contact, when they are talking with each other in some way, shape, or form, we tend to see that agreement bubble to the surface. And the squares can kind of act as a catalyst for us to keep pushing on something when really what we need to do is stop, you know? Quitting is courageous. We tend to really think about quitting as a failure, but sometimes quitting is the best thing that you can do if it's going to save you or save other people from harm, from burnout, from further difficulty, right? We don't always have to move at a breakneck pace. And sometimes the best thing that we can do is throw in the towel. And this is a really big part of the story of Sagittarius 3, which is where Mars is going to be moving through during this square to Saturn. Now, that final decan of Sagittarius is associated with the 10 of Wands in tarot. And if you're unfamiliar with what that image looks like, it is literally a guy who has 10 wands on his back. He looks like his back is about to break and he's just trying to trudge forward and put one foot in front of the other to carry these wands through to the finish line. And this decan is one that is co-ruled by the Sun and Saturn. So there's this really big energy of trying to fight and toil for glory, and also realizing that sometimes in that toil, you can just harm yourself. I always tell clients with placements here that it's one of those things where you have to recognize your limits, right? Which is a Saturnian theme. And Mars isn't so good at doing that. Mars wants to push past limits, to break past barriers. And coming up against that square to Saturn, Mars wants to just keep going, but Saturn is really putting the brakes on. So our ability to lean into that part of the final decan of Sagittarius where there's a win or there's a glory or there's a success to be had is probably going to be limited by Saturn saying no to something. So this is probably going to bring up a situation where not only are you running into conflict potentially in these areas of life, but also where you're going to have to accept that you might not be able to see something through to completion, and that there could be some challenging feelings that you have to navigate as a result of them, right? Mars in Sagittarius 3 is really asking what is worth the glory and what efforts are going to bring that solar success. But there's the other side of it that you need to ask yourself if it's only going to serve to harm you. Saturn in that final decan of Pisces is really concerned with what is going to be worth going to the ends of the earth for, who is worth going to the ends of the earth for, what kind of emotional labor is worth it. Right. And so I think that this Mars Saturn square is really going to show up as figuring out how to navigate emotional and relational discomfort when you're exhausted. Because Mars is that planet of action and energy. And when it runs into a square with Saturn and is already in this part of the zodiac that's kind of secretly really Saturnian by decan and bound, it's going to feel a little bit more like someone is saying stop, someone is saying slow down, and Mars is already trying to push through, but doesn't have a lot of energy anyway, right? It's kind of like this feeling of I'm carrying all these wands, I'm carrying all of this stress, all of this pressure, and then you make me stop moving. Like, how am I going to get to where I need to be, right? And when we think about this as kind of taking place in December, right before the holidays, where a lot of people get some time off, it feels like trying to push through a workload that you know you have to get done, and also running up against some limits, either other people kind of slowing you down or you feeling like you just don't have enough energy to push through and get everything done. And that feeling really stressful and pressurizing, right? I always think of harsh Mars Saturn stuff as stress tests. Right. And sometimes the best thing to do when your system is being overloaded with stress in a negative way is to try to find ways to take the burden off of your back, off of your shoulders. That's not always a possibility, which is why we also have to hold a little bit of space for the fact that it might just feel really hard at this time, and acting with a spirit of graciousness towards yourself and others is kind of the best thing that we can do, right? Go easy on yourself, choose easy mode when you can, because Mars and Saturn really, really agree on choosing hard mode. Mars in Sagittarius acts on principle and inspiration and enthusiasm and has kind of like a philosophy and a reason behind why it wants to progress forward, why it wants to fight for something, why it wants to expend so much energy and time on something. But Saturn in Pisces is putting some boundaries up to protect us from that emotional and energetic overwhelm. Saturn in Pisces is kind of like caring so much it hurts and then saying no to some things, even though they have an impact on you and even though you want to help, right? Like sometimes saying no is actually compassionate, I think is a really big Saturn in Pisces lesson, right? So there's kind of this theme of Mars and Sagittarius bringing up a lot of inspiration and a desire to go, go, go versus running into these emotional boundaries or these energetic boundaries, this weight of grief, this realization that even if you care and even if you want to pull something through to the finish line, sometimes the nicest thing that you can do for yourself, for another person, for whatever the situation is to say no, is to express your boundaries, right? And so the question that's probably going to be coming up for a lot of us is how do we take action when everything feels so heavy, when there is grief present, when there is difficulty showing up, And I think that it's going to probably feel like there's a lot of external frustration meeting with internal disappointment in a way that doesn't feel super good. The key is that it's not going to last forever, right? This is one transit happens on December 9th. We're going to get to the other side. There will be other planets that square Saturn that kind of reactivate this storyline. But this is definitely, in my opinion, the hardest one. And after Mars gets past the square with Saturn, they're going to enter Capricorn, where they really, really like to be. And they're going to be in a much more sympathetic relationship with Saturn. So know that this obstacle is temporary. It's not going to last forever. So try to move with a little bit of compassion for yourself during this time if it just feels a little bit like you want to bang your head into a wall with frustration, because that's usually how I feel when we're doing harsh Mars Saturn stuff. It's tension, it's pacing problems. Mars wants to go fast, Saturn's wading through the muck of the ocean floor. It's like a burnout thing. It's just not having the wherewithal to keep pushing forward even when you want to fight for the thing. Sometimes you just have to say no. I think this is a good transit where to say no to things that you don't need to take on, say no to additional weights. If someone asks you to put another wand on your back, you can say no, and that's okay. It doesn't diminish the glory. It doesn't diminish your accomplishments. It doesn't diminish your self-worth. Sometimes it's just like, I can't, I can't. I can't is a really good one. This Mars Saturn square. You can say I can't. All right, moving on. December 10th, we have Neptune stationing direct, and on the same day, Mercury is going to oppose Uranus. So Neptune's direct station is a really important one because this marks Neptune's final trek through Pisces before they re-enter Aries early next year, and we are finally done with this transit that has been going on for many, many years. This also is going to stop the mutual application between Saturn and Neptune's, which in basically technical astrology terms means they're both facing each other right now. Think about the way that your connection with another person intensifies when you're both looking at each other versus one of you kind of looking at the other person who's facing in the other direction, right? There's a lot more of an ability to communicate with each other when you're mutually applying to one another, when you're looking at one another, and have a little bit more of an influence for better and for worse. And Neptune and Saturn represent very different principles. Saturn wants boundaries. Neptune wants to dissolve boundaries. Neptune is a little bit more concerned with the mystical and the floaty and the dreamy and the illusion of the thing. And Saturn is a lot more concerned with what is real and what is tangible and what is material. What are the boundaries and the limits of the thing? And so when they are applying to one another, our sense of reality, our sense of time, our sense of what is real all becomes warped by Neptune. And we can kind of feel very ungrounded. And it can also really create a lot of confusion in our lives, especially when it comes to whatever Saturn is responsible for in your chart. So think about the areas of life that correspond with the Capricorn and the Aquarius. And if you want to take it one step further, Libra, because Saturn is also the exaltation lord of Libra. Those things might just feel a little hazy, a little fuzzy, I'm not sure how to move forward with these things. I'm not really sure what is even real here anymore right now. And as Saturn and Neptune stop applying to one another and Neptune starts moving on, that confusion is burst a little bit. There's a little bit less of an intensification around that. It can kind of start to be a moment where we move forward. They will meet again. We're not fully done. They're both going to be hanging out in Aries, but I think it is going to at least mark like a brief moment of kind of respite for us for all of the confusion and illusion that Neptune's been bringing to the table. This station for Neptune on December 10th as well can bring kind of like an exclamation mark to Neptune's transit through Pisces, which has really been the idealizing of the mystic, the spiritual, the martyr, the influencer, right? The lack of boundaries. Like, I can't stop thinking about how Neptune and Pisces kind of coincided with the birth of Instagram, the proliferation of everybody being on a device all of the time, where we are so interconnected that we've also lost a sense of connection and we've lost a sense of energetic boundaries. Right now, we expect people to reply to an email right away or reply to our text message right away, right? It's almost like we've become too lost in this Piscean soup of, there's not a lot of boundaries in Pisces anyway. And Saturn's been trying to construct some of that, but Neptune has also been almost like coming in and messing with Saturn's. I'm thinking of kind of like Saturn trying to build blocks and Neptune coming in and like taking them all down in one fell swoop. And then Saturn has to restart and rebuild. And that's almost been a little bit of what's been going on in this final part of Pisces for a while, that they've been getting closer and closer to one another. So, Neptune has really been creating this lack of boundaries. And I think as we start to see Neptune moving on from it, there might be a heightening of some of those themes. And also, we're kind of coming to the end of that, which hopefully will mark, a little bit more of a healthy relationship to one another, to our ideas that we all need to be so connected to one another all of the time. Connection is great, but the expectation that everyone is always available, always sharing parts of their lives that are maybe a little bit more intimate and sacred and don't need to be public, right? I don't know if that's always the best thing. And I think Neptune in Pisces has not necessarily made that better, but has made that a lot worse. So I'm hopeful that when Neptune moves into Aries again, we're going to get a little bit less of that. But I'm sure there will be a whole other host of problems. I'm kind of team Neptune is a malefic. I always think of that meme where the guy's like, change my mind, and I know that there will probably be a lot of people who disagree with that take. But I don't think it's ever fun to feel like you're like truly lost and confused and moving through the fog. And Neptune brings that, right? And wherever Pisces has been sitting in your chart, Neptune has been creating a fog for a very long time, and having some of that fog be popped, I think, is going to feel really nice for a lot of people. And this doesn't necessarily make the fog dissipate quite yet, but it does mean that we are getting one step closer to that. You might expect kind of some intensification around the Neptunian themes in that part of your life when it stations direct on December 10th. But I feel like, having Mercury oppose Uranus on that same day is really interesting, because Mercury Uranus aspects tend to bring up surprising news. And so it's almost like you're getting a surprising piece of information or unexpected information that is then influencing some of the ability to kind of see through some of the fog a little bit, now that Neptune and Saturn are not necessarily both applying to one another. Scorpio, where Mercury is going to be moving through, right, trines Pisces. So those two parts of your chart are intimately connected. When something happens in one, it automatically influences what happens in another. So it's like we get news in the Scorpio part of our chart that then causes something to shift forward and start moving forward and dispel some of the illusion that we have in the Pisces part of our chart. I think it kind of puts some cracks in the veneer, and it exposes them as the distortion of like reality from Saturn and Neptune is slightly less intense, but there can also just be, whenever a planet stations direct or retrograde, we tend to get a magnification of their principles. So it might feel like a slow, disillusionment, or a little bit of a fading of the fog after like an initial burst of fog, which I realize kind of sounds contradictory, but that's what it sounds like to me. Now, on December 11th, right after we get this Mercury Uranus opposition, Mercury is going to re-enter Sagittarius. So We're going to be wrapping up Mercury's post-retrograde shadow. What always happens after a planet stations retrograde is that they have to then move over those same degrees that they traveled through when they were retrograde. And I kind of think of it as them like tidying up all of the things that got unraveled, right? You can picture it as like someone walking through a garden where there's like a lot of little pebbles, and they're kind of like all the pebbles get spread out, as they're walking through, and then they have to go right back over and kind of clean it all up. That's the way that I think about it. And so we're going to see kind of that cleanup job happening as Mercury moves back through Sagittarius. We're going to see some of that retrograde story really starting to come to a close, some clarity and some ability to start moving forward and working through another story, right? Because at this time, we're still kind of doing that same retrograde story that we've been doing for a while. And after we get past that point, it's going to start feeling like there's a little bit more of an ability to move forward, to have new ways of thinking, new ways to process information, new ways to communicate about what's going on in the Sagittarius part of your chart, because Mercury is treading new ground. Passes the stationing degree on the 16th, 17th, depending on time zone. And that is actually, ironically, right after Mars leaves Sagittarius. So, we get a little bit less of a confusing, challenging sort of energy in that part of our charts right when Mercury starts moving and treading through new ground, which I just think is a little bit interesting. Now, Mercury is in detriment in Sagittarius. And while I love Mercury in Sagittarius on a personal level, that does mean that it tends to be a little bit more challenging for anyone who is in a Mercury ruled perfection year. So if you are in a Gemini or a Virgo perfection year, this can mark a time of greater confusion, of feeling a little bit less resourced, of not necessarily being able to communicate the way that you want to communicate, right? It's just like the Mercury stuff gets harder, and Mercury is responsible for communication, commerce, transportation, all of that stuff. So having Mercury enter Sagittarius, right around the holiday season when a lot of people tend to be traveling, probably just going to cause a little bit of chaos, and just be prepared for that, But I think Mercury in Sagittarius is nice in a way because Sagittarius is so concerned with meaning. And I think Mercury in Sagittarius communicates in a way that is really meaningful. And this can bring up more philosophical conversations. This can bring up more of a spirit of generosity, a desire to understand another person's point of view, right? We start considering the why behind everything. It also sparks a spirit of curiosity when it comes to the Sagittarius part of your life in general, right? How do you understand these topics that Sagittarius corresponds with at their core? And what have your recent experiences throughout this retrograde taught you about this area of life? And how does viewing things through more of a glass half full approach kind of support Mercury's journey through this sign, right? Because Sagittarius is ultimately ruled by Jupiter, and Jupiter is an optimist, ever the optimist, right? And likes to see things through a glass half full perspective. And Mercury in Sagittarius is really good at kind of giving the benefit of the doubt, of seeing things in a little bit more of a positive light, of looking for the silver lining, and operating from that perspective as Mercury moves through Sagittarius in an intentional way can also help kind of navigate some of the natural Mercury and detriment stuff that is a little bit more annoying sometimes. But that is going to be Mercury in Sagittarius. And then on December 15th, as I kind of just mentioned, we are going to have Mars enter Capricorn. Now, anyone who is in a Mars ruled perfection year, Aries or Scorpio, this is probably going to feel really nice for you because one, this gets rid of that sign-based Mars-Saturn square that we've been doing for a while, which, as I said before, tends to bring up a lot of pressure, kind of the stress test energy, a lot of pacing problems, kind of like wanting to bang your head against the wall sort of thing. And now Mars is in Saturn signs. They have this thing called reception, right? Saturn can see what Mars is doing, is able to support Mars, but also is responsible for Mars to some degree. So is going to take care of him a little bit more than when Mars was in Sagittarius and Saturn didn't really care much about resourcing or taking care of Mars. Now we have a little bit more of a sympathetic relationship between them. So it's going to make the Mars stuff feel a little bit easier. Mars loves to be in Capricorn. It is the sign of Mars's exaltation. If you don't know about exaltations in general, I have a whole lecture, workshop, talk on them on my website, which I would highly recommend checking out because it's going to give you a whole different perspective on understanding the signs, the planets, this concept of exaltation in general. But when Mars moves into Capricorn, all of a sudden it is elevated, right? To be exalted means to be raised up, right? To be in a lofty position. And it also tempers some of Mars's worst traits, right? Mars is very impulsive, and Capricorn is a cold, kind of dry territory, right? Saturn is a very cold, dry planet. So it tempers some of Mars's heat, which makes Mars a little bit less impulsive. It makes Mars a little bit less reactive and a lot more strategic and able to kind of plot and plan and think of a long-term vision, because Saturn, the ruler of Capricorn, is very concerned with the long term rather than the short term, which Mars is a little bit more keen to focus on. So we get a little bit more of like an ability to plot for the long term, right? This is really good for thinking about maybe your goals for 2026 and what you want to accomplish and how you want to go about doing them and creating some sort of an action plan around those things. Mars in Capricorn is the perfect kind of energy to lean into with that. Now, Mars in Capricorn doesn't mess around. Mars in Capricorn gets shit done. And what I love about this is that it does really feel like a total change from that Mars-Saturn thing where it just felt like, oh, I can't. And now it's like, oh, wait, I can actually. And I'm a lot more supported and a lot more resourced to be able to get things done, whatever it is that needs to get done. Now, despite that, right, despite the exaltation, Mars is still a malefic. And if you have a day chart, Mars is still going to be your most challenging planet. So this is going to bring some inflammation into the Capricorn part of your chart, right? It's applying heat there. It's pouring energy into that area. And it's asking what needs to change, what needs to be cut away, what needs to be clarified, right? That's kind of the best case scenario. But also just keep in mind that it can stir up a little bit of difficulty in that part of your life while Mars transits through this sign. For night charts, it's going to feel a lot better because Mars is on your team. Mars really wants to support you, right? So you get a little bit more of that ability to lean into the productive side of Mars in Capricorn without necessarily having some of the more, destructive qualities of Mars coming to the surface. And I say this as someone who has a day chart. So like we are in it together if you do too. We're always facing a malefic in some area of life. And I, for one, as someone who has a planet at 25 degrees of Sagittarius, where that Mars-Saturn square is taking place, I can't wait for Mars to get into Capricorn. Give me new problems. That's always how I feel when I get to the end of a malefic transit. I'm like, listen, we did that for a while. There's always going to be difficulty in some area of life. I'm ready for the new one, and all in, these challenges feel a lot more supportive. It feels like we can do something with them. They're for a reason because we have that sympathy between Mars and Saturn, whereas in Sagittarius, it just kind of felt like, just outright difficult. No gains to be had. We're just struggling. This feels like we're struggling to achieve something, right? Because Mars in Capricorn is very ambitious, has a goal, has an action plan, and wants to get shit done. So this is going to kick off Mars's journey, obviously, through Capricorn, but it also kicks off a greater journey through this sign that is going to be amplified when the Sun and Venus end up entering into Capricorn later this month as well. And we are actually in early January, which we're obviously going to talk about in the next forecast. We get a Mars-Venus cazimi where they both conjoin the sun at the same time, and they stay cazimi for like 4 days if we're using the 1 degree range. So from January 6th to January 10th. So this is starting to build up to that, right? And cazimis provide a lot of aha moments and clarity and illumination and an ability to gain a greater understanding of what is going on, along with highlighting the properties of whatever planet is getting pulled into that conjunction. And so we're starting to see a little bit of that story building up as Mars enters Capricorn. So kind of keep that in mind, that whatever difficulty is arising, there's going to be a lot more of an ability to see why that is come early Jan. We're just not quite there yet. Now, on December 17th, the sun is going to square Saturn at the exact same degree that Mars did. The sun is responsible for our vitality, for our confidence, for our spirit, right? And this kind of gives me the feeling of like being humbled a little bit in a way that doesn't feel super good, right? It's like you're being cast down. A shadow is being thrown on the light from Saturn, which can make it feel a little bit more depressing, quite honestly. Saturn is the planet of melancholy, and the sun is about our mind and our intellect and our spirit and our vitality. So when you have those two coming into a harsh aspect with one another, it can literally feel like there is a shadow being cast upon those things that naturally buoy us and keep us feeling in a kind of like in a place of illumination and, confidence and happiness. And so I would say December 17th and the days leading up are probably going to feel a little bit more challenging as the sun gets closer and closer to that square with Saturn. This is going to be harder for people who are in a Leo perfection year because the sun is in charge of your year. So any transits that the sun makes are going to be a lot more important for you. And this one, it's going to activate a little bit more of that tendency to doubt yourself, to feel like something is saying no, to have a lot of expectations and responsibilities be placed on your shoulders and feeling like you're kind of coming up against that in a way that doesn't feel super supportive. Again, this just kind of feels like end of the year stuff where it's like, there's so much to get done. I feel like this is really heavy. I have all these responsibilities and this work, and I just don't want to do it. I'm tired and I want to take time off and spend it with my family or spend it hanging out on the couch watching Netflix or whatever it is that you do. Hopefully you're getting time off around the holidays. If you work in retail, my heart is with you. I did that for a long time, and it is not the fun time of year to be working in retail. So you guys are, I feel for you. But I feel like that Sun-Saturn square is just kind of feeling like a little bit down, a little bit dreary, a little bit more melancholic, and doubting yourself a little bit more. That's a common Sun-Saturn thing, is not having as much of a sense of confidence and self-belief, because Saturn is the planet of doubt. So this can be a doubt on your ability to get things done, a doubt on your ability to accomplish something, and just feeling a little bit lower. But as I said, with the Mars-Saturn square, right, these things pass. They don't stick around. It's going to feel like you probably get told no in some contexts, especially when it comes to Sagittarius, Pisces part of your charts, right? It's like Saturn is saying no to something that the sun is trying to do in Sagittarius. It can also potentially bring up some challenges with authority figures, because the sun tends to speak to authority figures and Saturn tends to speak to elders and kind of established figures. So them coming into a conflict with one another can often bring up, like, this could be like a fight with your boss, or like trying to, speak your mind, and someone telling you like, no, you shouldn't do that, who's in a position of authority, and taking that really hardly, like taking that as like, oh wow, I really messed up, I shouldn't have said that, and then doubting yourself and kind of getting into a place where you're just, not as kind to yourself. And what I would say is to be kind to yourself, right? To know that this is coming. And this is the beauty of knowing the astrology, is an capacity to see these things and to know that it exists outside of you, that other people are going through similar situations, and that this too shall pass. So, hang in there. It's not the fun one. These squares with Saturn, and we get a lot of them, are not necessarily super enjoyable. The final thing I'll say about this square with Saturn that the sun makes on December 17th is that it does highlight that Mars-Saturn square story, because it occurs at the same degree. So some of the strife and the difficulty that occurred around that time, we are now seeing a light being cast on that. My hope is that it brings a little bit of an ability to move past some of it, but we still have Venus, who also has to go through this square. And I think if there's any planet that's going to be a little bit more capable of smoothing things over, I think it's going to be Venus, not the sun. But Venus-Saturn squares aren't, usually fun on paper either. So we'll see. On December 20th, we get a new moon at 28 degrees of Sagittarius. And, this is still in a very tight square to Saturn. Like, it's at 28, Saturn's at 25 at this time, I believe, still, is really hanging out at that degree for so long. I know that myself, and I'm sure all of the other people with placements at 25 degrees, are just begging Saturn to move along, dude. You've been here for too long. Can we get this show on the road? But this is that new moon, right? So we have the moon conjoining the sun at 28 degrees. And you can see, if you are watching the video version, that Venus is also really coming up on that square with Saturn as well. She's at 24 degrees at this time, Saturn's at 25, and this new moon's at 28. So Saturn's kind of harming the luminaries, with the square, and Venus doesn't really have that much of a capacity to help out, because not only is she also coming up against the square to Saturn, but she is combust at this time, which basically means that she is being harmed by the rays of the sun. You can imagine that when a planet gets too close to this other planet who's very hot and dry, they kind of become a little bit weakened by that relationship. If you are outside on a hot, sunny day, right, and you look up at the sky, you look up at the sun, you can't see anything else around it, right? That's kind of what Venus is going through right now. So she's a little bit further away, a little bit less visible, and a little bit less able to support us. But nevertheless, any new moon is an opportunity to turn the page in a certain part of our lives and in a certain part of our chart. And I think because we have been doing so many of these Saturn squares, and we still are doing that Venus Saturn square in particular, to me, this feels like there's been a defeat, there's been a loss, there's been a rejection in the Sagittarius part of our chart. And now we have to move forward in the wake of whatever that Mars-Saturn and Sun-Saturn transit brought up for us. This is almost like, okay, well, I guess since that shit happened, like I have no choice but to start new, to start fresh, to try something different, to make a change, right? Because the moon and the sun are separating from Saturn at this point. So they're still carrying that story with them, but they are moving ahead to new ground. And the sun is about to enter Capricorn, where it's going to have a much nicer relationship with Saturn, similarly to what we saw with Mars. And so, it feels a little bit more like you're exhausted, you're tired, you're a little bit worse for wear after some of those squares, but you have no choice but to start fresh. There's no choice but to put one foot in front of the other, even when you're tired, even when you're over it. So it might feel more like an ending that necessitates a new beginning rather than necessarily feeling like, oh, look, I have this brand new sparkling opportunity in front of me. Even if this is ruled by Jupiter and Cancer. Jupiter and Cancer is averse to this lunation. It can't see it, can't offer resources, and is retrograde, right? So not a lot of capacity to offer support, even if the moon is in Jupiter sign and Jupiter's in the moons. I think it's not going to feel as happy-go-lucky as we might anticipate or we might be hoping for. And I wish I was able to give better news, but unfortunately, that is kind of what this lunation looks like, and very shortly after, just a couple hours after, the moon is going to move into Capricorn. The moon's in detriment in Capricorn, and she's going to conjoin Mars. So it looks like there's like this new thing that starts. It's kind of on the heels of something challenging, and then we run into a potential conflict or something that feels really unsettling in our body, because the moon is also just representative of that. I would say, take it really easy on your body if you can. Try not to overwhelm yourself physically or strain yourself physically, right? Moon Mars conjunctions can bring up a lot of tension in your body, where you're like clenching your jaw and your shoulders are really tight. And you're not necessarily just like in a state of ease or comfort. And that's highlighted by the fact that the moon is also in detriment at this time. So take it easy, hydrate, right? These planets are thirsty. The moon is dried out in Capricorn, right? And so one of the ways that you can combat some of that is to just hydrate, to move in a way that feels good, right? Get some of this energy out, but not to overdo it. Like I wouldn't go throw like a ton of weights around, maybe go for like a nice walk, little bit yoga, move that energy through you in a way that feels good and supportive for you and your capacity, while being mindful of the fact that your capacity is probably not going to be as much as it usually is. And this is right on the heels of that kind of new moon that felt a little, so it's just kind of like take care on the 20th. It's not super fun, that one, unfortunately. Now, on the 21st, the sun is going to enter Capricorn and the moon is going, or sorry, the moon. I'm getting my words all tangled up now. The sun is going to enter Capricorn later this day, and also Venus is going to square Saturn. So we're kind of doing two different changes of energy at the same time, but we've also been leaning into that Venus Saturn square for a while now. All around, like, again, not the fun stuff. Like, I wish that there was more fun things happening in December that I got to come on here and tell you guys it's all going to be great and exciting. But Saturn squares are kind of depressing. They're kind of just like not a great time, especially if you've got a night chart. And, It does amplify the focus in Capricorn, especially with the sun moving through there. But the sun doesn't have a lot of dignity in Capricorn. Like it's got some triplicity in Sagittarius. It feels in its element in Sagittarius, but it doesn't have that in Capricorn. So it can feel a little bit more solemn. Right. This is in a lot of ways, it's the start of the like actual winter season, where it starts getting really cold and you're inside a lot and you're just like, you're not seeing the sun, right? That is very symbolic of what's going on during this time, especially obviously if you're in the northern hemisphere. So this is going to amplify the focus on the Capricorn part of our chart because now we're obviously going to have Mars and the sun moving through this part of our chart. So whatever house Capricorn occupies for you, you can expect to gain a little bit more clarity as the sun moves through there, right? But the sun in Capricorn is also a little bit less optimistic and a little bit less cheery than the sun in Sag generally. But I think that the alleviation of the Saturn square is just kind of like a trade-off, right? It creates more of like a kind of ability to keep moving through because of that sympathetic relationship between the sextile between the sun in Capricorn and Saturn in Pisces. So it's not as immediately challenging by aspect necessarily, but it's still a little bit more glum than we would expect from having like the previous sun in Sagittarius transit. They can also create a little bit more of a propensity to think long term, right? Like, especially with Sun and Mars there, like now we have a little bit more of an ability to commit to the visions that you have for the future of the Capricorn part of your chart, with Mars doing the action planning and the Sun bringing a little bit more of a ideal or a vision into things. So that's kind of the Sun moving into Capricorn, right? Really good for planning, also really good for healing. Those first two decades of Capricorn are very focused on healing and health. So taking care of your body, taking care of your mental, right? Trying to find ways that you can alleviate some of the pressure that was placed on you through those Saturn squares is also going to be a good way to kind of lean into some of the more positive and supportive parts of the sun moving through Capricorn. Now we have that Venus Saturn square on the same day, which is not really a great vibe for anything that Venus is responsible for, right? And she is the planet of love and creativity and beauty and devotion. And so oftentimes with Venus Saturn squares, we tend to face a rejection in one of those things, right? It's almost like whatever you want to create, the relationships that you're tending to, whatever it is that you're nurturing, all of a sudden there's something that comes along and makes that feel harder and uglier and more difficult and just not super supported. Again, just like the sun, just like Mars, Venus will move on, right? This isn't forever, but it is still not the super fun one. Venus, I don't think loves being in this final decan of Sagittarius that is literally called the Lord of Oppression. Ask me how I know. I have my Venus there. So it's not a super fun part of the zodiac for her. Venus doesn't like to be oppressed, Venus doesn't like to be dealing with Saturn, right? They are one's a benefic, one's a malefic, one's a nocturnal planet, one's a diurnal planet, right? Beyond the fact that they kind of share rulership of Libra through domicile and exaltation, there's a lot of ways in which Saturn's rejection of things is contrary to Venus's desire to proliferate, to grow, to create, to generate, to love, to harmonize, to unify. And that can feel difficult relationally in particular when we are then having those two planets in a harsh aspect with one another, because it's going to highlight all of the things they disagree on, right? And so, I would be a little bit more prepared for some relational discomfort this day, especially because we're kind of coming off that Mars-Saturn stuff and also the moon conjoining Mars, right? It just looks a little pokey. It looks a little uncomfortable. And so as much as you can be nice to yourself and be nice to others, and I know I say that all the time, but it's the antidote to a lot of this stuff, right? When we have a greater awareness of the fact that we aren't the only one struggling, but everybody else is going through something too. I think it can help us move with a little bit more compassion and a little bit more grace, right? Where it's like if someone snaps at you or says something that isn't the kindest, there can be a little bit more of an ability to step back and to not take it personally. Because it's like, you're doing Venus Saturn stuff. I'm doing Venus Saturn stuff. We both feel like shit. Yeah. Okay. I get it, and then you can move on with your day and not necessarily have it stay with you for too long. So yeah, just kind of take it easy on yourself with that Venus Saturn stuff, because it's not super easy and it can bring about relational endings or creative endings. It's not necessarily fun. What I will say, if we want to try to be positive about it, is that there's some kind of mutual reception going on between them, right? Saturn is in Venus's exaltation. Venus is in Saturn's decadent and bound during those times. There's a little bit more of an ability to kind of try to support each other, even through the discomfort and the difficulty and the rejection that they are kind of stirring up. So there's, Venus in the superior position, which means she's overcoming Saturn. She has more of an ability to kind of exert her will on Saturn. She wins this battle, basically. Right. And so, because of that, it makes it so it's a little bit easier. I think she's trying to bring a salve to some of the Mars Saturn square stuff, Sun Saturn square stuff. I think she's still running into a lot of difficulty that makes that hard for her to do. But it doesn't mean she's not trying. And it doesn't mean that we don't feel a little bit of that, right? So just move with compassion. December 24th, Venus is going to move into Capricorn, which is really going to bring some alleviation. Venus likes to be in Capricorn a lot more than she likes to be in Sagittarius, right? She has triplistic dignity in earth signs. So this makes her feel more in her element, more happy, more at ease. But it does also really highlight the combustion thing that we talked about before, where she still feels a little bit hard to access and hard to tap into. So this can create kind of circumstances where relationship matters, your desires, they become more private, they become more occulted, they can feel harder to tap into, or like you're not necessarily telling people about them, right? This is like the going to hook up with someone on Christmas Eve and like not telling your family type of thing. Like that's kind of what this feels like to me, is like that Venus combust thing is like the definition of like a sneaky link is a combust Venus sort of situation, right? And having that happen around the holidays when usually you're like with family and not really doing that, it's kind of like, oh no, but I need to go do something on the low, but also feeling like maybe you can tap into the things that you really want to do because you are surrounded by people or circumstances that make it harder for you to access those things that would naturally bring you a source of pleasure and joy. But I think Venus in Capricorn, she's in it for the long haul, right? She's in it for the legacy. She's able to find beauty in ugly places. She's easier to kind of get along with, I think, because she knows struggle, because she knows Saturn. And Capricorn in general is the most malefic sign, right? It is Saturn's domicile and Mars's exaltation. And so, excuse me, when Venus is here, like she has this awareness over how sacred life is because there has been some sort of struggle, right? And so she can empathize with people who've been through a lot of situations a lot more easily. I see Venus and Capricorn people being really, really good at that, having a lot of compassion for people who have gone through hardships, and being able to connect with them. I think a really great way to use this kind of energy, not use, but like tune into it, is to go volunteer at like a soup kitchen, or to donate things, or to, create that spirit of Venusian care and compassion, and to bring it to those who have gone through difficult situations, right? And I think the holidays are always a really good time to kind of spread the love a little bit more, because it can bring up a lot of things for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. And I think it's a time where we can all just kind of practice being a little bit nicer to each other, a little bit more considerate what other people are going through. And so, yeah, Venus is really good at doing that in Capricorn. So that's a really great way to kind of lean into this energy. Now that Venus is going to be in Capricorn, we also have that Sun, Mars, Venus co-presence activated once again, right? Which is so interesting because you have the wound of Mars and the care of Venus, the inflammation of Mars and the salve that Venus brings, the conflict that Mars wants to stir up, and the resolution that Venus tries to create, all bundled up into one, right? And one of the Venus, Mars, Saturn kind of, I don't know, significations, having all of those planets moving through one part of the chart or in a chart, right, is like being known for fighting for your values, right? For fighting for beauty, for creating things through difficulty and strife and labor, to help bring something supportive into the world, right? This can also create a little bit more of a tendency to be a little bit more risky in love and in flirtations, a little bit more bolder, a little bit more audacious, a little bit more sexy. I think it can be fun in that way. But it's really going to be ramping us up to that dual Kazumi that we see in early January now that Venus has joined the show. So just kind of expect that you're going to be kind of teeter-tottering back and forth between some of those Martial significations and some of the Venus significations, which do often feel like two ends of a spectrum, right? They're domiciles opposed one another. So they have a lot of ways in which they represent opposing principles to each other. And all of that is going to be getting highlighted and illuminated by the sun. And because this is happening in Capricorn, you really want to think about what house Capricorn occupies for you, what part of the chart that signifies, and what themes are most corresponding with that area of life, because that is where you're going to be seeing a little bit of this push and pull, right? A little bit of the difficulty of Mars and also the ability to bring some blessings in because of Venus, right? It's a both and situation, not a neither nor, right? You're going to get some Mars, you're going to get some Venus, you're going to get some of the ways that those things feel at odds with one another. It's probably going to feel a little bit confusing. But when we get to January, it's all going to start making sense when those two planets join the sun at the same time. Now, because she's in Capricorn, she's not squaring Saturn anymore. I do think that is going to make us feel a little bit less sad, a little bit less stressed out. So, Merry Christmas. You're a little bit less sad now. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it anyway. And finally, we finish off the month with Mercury squaring Saturn. This is the last planet who has to get through that square, right? Mercury is trailing behind everybody else because of their retrograde stations. They're really starting to pick up the pace now. This happens on December 30th, right? And this kind of just feels like getting bad news, or like the party's canceled, like you have plans for New Year's Eve and then you find out like, oh, actually it's not going to happen. It's can also bring up like the desire to express your beliefs in particular, and to have that be stifled, or to have someone kind of tell you to be quiet or to sit down. Arguments with authority figures is a common one. To me, this is like arguing about politics at like the family dinner table or something like that, right? It's not necessarily the super fun one, right? Where it's like Mercury wants to debate, but in Sag, it's also about like the philosophical stuff. It's about the beliefs and the ideals, religion and spirituality, and all of those things that Jupiter is concerned with. And then coming up against that square with Saturn, and it's like, no, I don't agree. I actually disagree. This is why I disagree. This is why you're wrong. This is why you should never say that again. It's not super fun. We're just doing like the final square. The thing that's interesting about this, though, is that we do finally have this square happening at 26 degrees. So all of the other squares that we had, Mars-Saturn, Sun-Saturn, Venus-Saturn, were at 25 degrees. So this does feel like we are starting to at least move on from that intensity on that singular degree. So we're talking about some of those things, and that might feel hard and heavy. It's almost like we're revisiting some of those endings, but with the perspective that we are also moving forward, right? I'm hopeful that Mercury is going to give us the capacity to start pushing through and moving this story along, right? And so often with Mercury, the answer is communication. The answer is let's talk about it. All of those icky, hard feelings that Mars, Sun, and Venus kind of went through as they squared Saturn. Mercury is like, all right, let's revisit some of those things. Let's talk about these things. Let's talk about the ending. Let's talk about the new beginning that started with that new moon in Sagittarius, and how some of that might feel really hard, but we also have to take a look at it, right, to be able to move forward. And that is where we finish off the year. There's not really anything major that happens on the 31st, and then we will be in a whole new year in 2026. And even if I am someone who goes a little bit more by the astrological calendar, my new year is when the sun gets into Aries. I still feel like it's always a really ripe moment for just kind of turning a metaphorical page, looking ahead, and starting to immerse ourselves into a whole new year of opportunity, of experience, and of different astrological alignments, right? 2026 is going to be an interesting one. We get Jupiter moving into Leo. We get eclipses starting in Aquarius and Leo. I feel like Leo is really going to be, the star of the show next year in a lot of ways. And we kind of begin that anew as we start looking ahead towards the astrology of 2026, which I hope you guys will be joining me to kind of dive into all of the different months of the year. I hope you enjoyed this forecast and that it gave you something to chew on, reflect on, and, validate some of the potential ups and downs that you are going to be experiencing in December. If you did enjoy, make sure to leave a review, like, subscribe, do all the things. It really helps me out. It takes you about 2 seconds. It would be a really lovely end of the year gift for me. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to share it with a friend so they can also be ready for all of the exciting moments. So that's how we want to call it, that happened this month. So thank you for sticking around. Thank you guys for being with me this year. And I am so excited to keep moving forward with you in the future. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.